那我们接下来呢就要来进行我们今天的第一场大会主题演讲了。Ladies and gentlemen, we would now like to begin our first keynote speech today. 那我们今天的大会主题演讲是使用台湾原生品牌 iPad 爱比科技所开发的 Verbal.ai 翻译服务，在荧幕上将会出现中英文字幕，来供各位来宾参考。Ladies and gentlemen, today's keynote speech will have real-time translation powered by Verbal.ai, developed by Taiwan-based brand iPad. Bilingual subtitles in Chinese and English will be displayed on the screen to help everyone follow along. 首先呢，让我们欢迎我们的讲者，趋势科技网路犯罪研究前瞻威胁研究总监 Mr. Robert McArdle 为我们带来主题 AI 时代的网路犯罪趋势与资安防御革命。Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. McArdle to give his presentation. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk to you all about AI threats, how we can defend against them, and why I think the security industry is in a great position to actually jump ahead of criminals. But before we can do any of that, we have to talk about non-AI threats today. So let's start off with a simple question. What is today's threat landscape? Well, the answer is actually very simple. It's ransomware. Right, that's it. I can go home now, right? Presentation over. But in reality, there's actually a whole bunch of other attacks that we see happening every day as well. And this gives a pretty decent summary of the main attacks we see. But the real question that I want to ask is what will be tomorrow's threat landscape? And to do that and proactively get ahead, this is the wrong question. The correct question is, why is today's threat landscape? Which is actually terrible grammar in English, but it looks better on the slide for the transition. The good news is we already know a bit about what is going to happen next, and we can predict with reasonable certainty what is going to come along. But to do that, we need to think a bit about what is happening today. So when talking about today's cybercrime ecosystem, we have to start with ransomware, because other threats exist, of course, but it's the most visible of all different attacks. And for the defenders in the room, you have lots of detailed guides on deep technical dives on different ransomware groups from the likes of Trend Micro and others. But to understand it properly and think of the future, we have to look at it at a higher level. We have to ask, why is ransomware actually successful for criminals? And to understand that, we need to go on a little bit of a history lesson of how ransomware actually came to be in the first place. So in the early days of cybercrime, criminal business models were all about theft. So when you think about cybercrime, you might think of criminals stealing credit card details or passwords or banking details and then selling them on marketplaces to each other. But then in 2013, we had the first of what we call these nexus events. Nexus events are like major changes in cybercrime forced by external factors. So we saw a arrival of encryption and the original ransomware. Now, ransomware at the time was very different to what you see today. It was a volume business designed to infect as many people around the world as possible and make a few $100 from each of them. And it's also technically a completely different type of crime. It's actually extortion, which is different from the theft-based crime we saw up to this point. But the problem is, individuals don't have that much money. I don't know about anybody in this room, but I sadly do not have millions of dollars in my bank account. So if criminals want to make that kind of money, they have to find someone else to target, which is exactly what they did. So they went out and they ultimately targeted companies. And around the same time, Bitcoin was becoming very popular for transferring large amounts of money around the world for the first time. So in 2018, we started seeing more companies being targeted by ransomware, not individuals. And when you target a company, it drastically changes your attack. If you're targeting everyone in this room, we can send email or browser exploits. But for companies, you have to break in, you have to move around the network, you need admin credentials, ultimately deploy the actual ransomware. So it's more sophisticated. But it lets criminals do something they couldn't do up to this point, which was make a lot of money out of companies' data. Because if you want to sell a company's data to somebody, it's hard to find a buyer. But there's one person who will always be interested to pay for their data, and that is the actual organization itself, because they value it. Fast forward a little bit further, and about 4 years ago, ransomware evolved once again into the current model, which we call double extortion ransomware. So the original ransomware model for companies has one fatal flaw, which is backups. If a company has a decent backup strategy, they're actually in a good position to defend against ransomware. So criminals added a third crime to the list, blackmail. Companies might not pay to restore their files, but they will pay to avoid brand damage and regulations and so on. And it's this combination of three different types of crime, blackmail, extortion, and theft, that makes ransomware the most profitable cybercrime of all time. Also, modern cybercrime is globally targeted. It's not actually regional in focus. So on the left-hand side is a map of all the different ransomware groups that affected the APAC, and on the right-hand side, the groups that affected the world in the same time period. Now, they look a little bit different, but if you look at the top 10, it's pretty much exactly the same between both of these. And that's true for any sort of data. If you divide any data by region or industry, it will look like certain regions or industries are actually higher. But in reality, cybercriminals are opportunistic. They don't really target any one country over another. But ransomware doesn't exist in isolation. The reason why it's so successful is the whole concept of cybercrime as a service. If you're a cyber criminal, you can go on to forums and get access to any sort of service you need to create your criminal business. And when you combine that with the amount of money that is involved in cybercrime, it has a Silicon Valley type effect, where it's very easy to create a criminal startup. And ultimately, at the moment, the most successful criminal startups happen to be in a ransomware area. On the human side of things, the lives of some of these key cyber criminals is playing out a bit like a movie. Take, for example, Maxim Yakubets. Maxim has at least 15 years involved in being a cyber criminal. He started with banking Trojans and has since made tens of millions of dollars out of ransomware attacks as part of his criminal group called Evil Corp, which is not the most subtle name out there. Here's also a picture of Yakubets standing next to one of his many Lamborghinis. This happens to be a personal favorite of his because the license plate number spells out the Russian word for thief. Also, more importantly, here's a picture of his wedding that cost approximately $250,000, and it was to the daughter of a high-ranking FSB officer, and it was attended by many members of important society in Russia. So the FSB, if you don't know, they're one of Russia's leading intelligence agencies. And Maxim now actually works for that state agency while still running his criminal empire on the side. So if you think about an actor like this who has 2 decades of experience doing cybercrime and essentially no risk of ever going to jail, and think about the people in this room who have 2 decades of experience. You're all good at your jobs, right? And so are people like this. This is the quality of criminal that we have to go up against. And we see this increased crossover as well between very senior cyber criminals also starting to work with their state, whether that's the Russian state, DPRK, Iran, China, and so on. Nation states, or APT attacks themselves, if I click on, click. Oh, can we go to the next slide? There we go. Yes. So nation states or APT attacks themselves are something we study in depth. And when you start studying nation state attacks, you'll start to see certain campaigns and groups emerging over time. And you might think, how can anybody predict what somebody with the resources of a state are actually going to do next? But in reality, it's actually relatively easy. We see certain conflicts around the world, for example, Russia against the West, or Russia against Ukraine, or China and Taiwan, and you can actually figure out what is going to happen next in these cases. And the reason is, simply read any of these guides. These are the official military doctrines and 5-year plans of a lot of the countries out there, like Russia, China, and the United States, or analysis of those military plans by their competitor countries. And the long-term objectives of any nation-state attack aligns to what the state itself wants to do. So you can simply read their policies and get a good idea and go ahead of them. But when attacks like ransomware and BEC and APT are today's modern cybercrime, it's a different emerging threat that we worry about today, which is the whole emergence of AI attacks. Now, there is a lot of hype and worry in this area. So Trend Micro put out a series of publications on this where we actually told what is actually happening with cybercrime, not what could happen with cybercrime. And I'll go into a bit of detail on that in a moment. We also actually have been publishing on AI attacks for some time. Back in 2020, we were actually advising the United Nations and Europol on a strategic paper where we laid out the next 5 to 10 years of what we expect cybercrime attacks to be. And this paper is still very relevant today in terms of what's actually happening. So how are criminals using AI today? Well, the first case is the same as every software developer in the room. They're just using it to write better code. But in this case, it's malware that they're creating. And right now, it is being used more as a debugger to assist the malware developer. It's not yet replacing them. The second use case is to make their existing attacks better. So take, for example, phishing attacks. If you have the ability of a large language model, like OpenAI's or others like this, it can really help when it comes to crafting realistic-looking emails. And that has some big benefits. It allows criminals to target languages realistically they never could before. So a criminal today based in Iran or in Russia can write absolutely perfect Mandarin language phishing emails that all of you will read and believe is written by a native person. It also, with large language models, they can use, for example, RAGs, if you're familiar with that concept. And they could take entire books on social engineering, put that into the model, so that when that email is sent, it will have all of the tricks like urgency, authority, fear, and all the other tricks that we put into best practice phishing emails. When you talk about the state of criminal large language models, it's actually pretty tame. So to date, we've only seen a handful of these different large language models. One is Worm GPT, that is purely created for criminal purposes. What's more common to see is a trend around jailbreak as a service. So if you're familiar with the term jailbreaking, it's essentially getting a large language model to disobey its own guardrails, to do the things it's not supposed to do, like write malware or give dangerous code and things like that out there. And this is by far the most common uses of large language models for criminals today. You have whole groups within cybercrime that will keep up to date with the latest models, constantly be looking for ways to bypass the restrictions they have, and then other criminals will pay to access that as a service. The other major area where criminals make use of AI today is, of course, deepfakes. And about a year ago, we started seeing genuine criminal deepfake services come online, where you could pay as little as $10 up to about $400 per minute of actual video that you wanted to generate. This example is from a Russian group called Melvin, and for some reason, all of their demo videos involve Elon Musk. If you want to see what this person, who definitely is not Elon, looks like, chestnuts roasting, which is pretty realistic, right? On an open fire. And that's actually about a year ago that this technology came out. Today, there are no real criminal deepfake services. And the reason's very simple why. Because today we see many, many commercial and free deepfake services on the internet. So why would criminals design their own one when they can simply use any of these ones that are actually constantly maintained and built for them? And as a result of so many different services, which are all legitimate, by the way, the price keeps dropping lower and lower, and the quality keeps getting higher and higher. So the depressing part is that the deepfakes we have today are the worst quality deepfakes and the most expensive deepfakes we will ever have. They are only going to get better and cheaper. Where criminals then use these deepfakes is they deploy them with different types of attacks. They have volume attacks, where they try to scam as many people as possible, which was done here with an impersonation of the Binance CEO. And then they have targeted attacks, where they go after individuals, for example, CEO fraud. There's a famous example where one finance worker wired $25 million from a company in Hong Kong because they were on a video call where every single other person was a deepfake of one of their colleagues. There's also the example of virtual kidnapping, which is a horrific crime where you will get a phone call from your loved one, normally a daughter or son, who is claiming to be tortured on the phone. But it's all done with audio deepfakes to get you to actually pay for it. But none of these attacks are particularly earth-shattering. It's just a little bit better than what they've been doing so far. So why is that? Well, in Trend Micro, we have what we call the 3 rules of being a cyber criminal, and it really helps you understand how criminals think. Number 1, criminals want an easy life. That's the entire point of being a cyber criminal. Otherwise, you'd be doing a real job, right? Number 2, for criminals to adopt any new attack, the return of investment has to be better than what they're currently doing, which actually makes it quite hard with ransomware because it's so profitable today. And the 3rd rule is that cybercrime is an evolution, not a revolution. In other words, they make small changes over time. They rarely have big jumps in innovation unless they really have to, right? So they don't have like R&D departments like companies would tend to have. And all that means they primarily focus on changing their model to be a little bit better than it was yesterday, not big jumps in innovation, which is going to be a major disadvantage for them as we go into this AI era. But right now, we're going into a new one of these major change or nexus events for criminals. And there's 3 reasons for that. The first is that law enforcement are having some of their most successful time ever against cybercrime attacks. So 2024 had dozens of arrests and takedowns by international law enforcement. And I'm going to call out 2 of the biggest here, which Trend Micro happened to be part of. The first is LabHost, the takedown of the largest ransomware group that we have ever seen to date. And what happened in this case was law enforcement took over their leak site and actually leaked details about the criminals themselves, their code, their Bitcoin wallets, everything about them all in this site. They also named the author of this ransomware, who had made $100 million from running this ransomware over time, a person called Dmitry Kurashev. Incidentally, Apple also want to talk to Dmitry because they want to explain to Dmitry the correct way to wear an AirPod, which is not like that. Also, the second case we were involved in was one called Operation Stargroup, which was for LabHost phishing as a service. So phishing is a very easy way to gain initial access for ransomware groups. In this case, we were successful in helping law enforcement track down and arrest one of the 2 admins, who you can see in the bottom left. And they also went to several of the 2,000 users of the service, went into their houses, seized money, seized laptops, and so on. The problem, however, was that there's one other admin of this service, and they still had thousands of users. So how can you stop them just simply bringing it back up? Well, can I get a quick show of hands? Who here in the room has a Spotify account? Spotify? A few people? Okay. So if you're familiar with Spotify, Spotify have a thing at the end of every year where they call out your favorite songs you listen to and genres and so on, called Spotify Wrapped. Well, law enforcement generated something like this and sent it to every single user of the LabHost tool.
Welcome to your LabHost Wrapped, your recap of all the data we have about you.
Ooh, apparently that goes on longer. So for some reason, that's not playing true. But how it actually played out was they called out all the IP addresses that the users used, every domain that they accessed, everything they did on that platform they showed them, including the countries they targeted, the countries they connected from, and so on. And then they highlighted to those users that they essentially knew exactly who they were. They even sent it to their actual real name in every single case. So fast forward, and what happened was they also contacted all of the users of the service on Telegram, because there's 2,000 users, and that's a lot of people to arrest. It's a lot of paperwork. So they simply asked them, please press 1 if you would like to confess, please press 2 if you would like to go to your nearest police station, and so on. Now, they got a lot of very angry replies, but this was ultimately successful because LabHost took the service completely offline 24 hours later, and it has not come back again since. So overall, in 2024, we saw a lot of arrests and a lot of uncertainty showing up in cybercrime. The second reason is that ransomware might actually be in decline right now. So if we look at the number of ransomware groups that are out there, there's actually the most ransomware groups we've ever tracked. There was 53 different groups in Q4. And you might think that's a bad thing. Now, the best number of ransomware groups would, of course, be 0. But the next best number would be 100 or 200. We actually want a really fragmented market like this. You don't want one dominant group that is so much bigger than everybody else. Because when any group of humans come together and start working to try to optimize, they automate, they get more industrialized, and they get better at what they do. So stopping any group get to that size is one of the biggest successes of the last couple of years. Other reasons why ransomware might be in decline, if you look at payment data for ransoms from companies like Chainalysis who track the blockchain, the payment of ransomware was actually down last year. And from our own data, we saw that the number of leaks of companies last year was higher than any previous time, which you might think is a bad thing. But if you think about this, payments represent successful ransomware cases. Leaks represent unsuccessful ransomware cases. So all of this together shows that ransomware is taking a hit because of law enforcement disruption. The market is very fragmented. There's stronger business practices in organizations like all of yours, and there's stronger security solutions. In particular, solutions using AI have a very big advantage against something like ransomware because you can see events from multiple angles very quickly. So when we look at that, there's these three reasons I said: ransomware in decline, law enforcement operating against them, and security uses of AI, and criminals are being forced to once again innovate in some way. So how do they do that? The obvious answer is, of course, with AI. But in this case, it won't be large language models that will be the major driver for the next change in criminal use. It will be agentic AI. So if you're not familiar with agentic, we've done a lot of research in this area already. If you've heard of tools like OpenAI's Operator or Gemini 2.0 or large action models, they all refer to agentic AI. I'm going to make a bit of an educated bet that most of you in this room, by early 2026, or certainly by the end of 2026, will have an AI coworker that actually works with you. So how these models work is, instead of one all-powerful AI that's super intelligent, you have a series of small, simpler agents which all specialize at doing one thing and one thing only, but they do it better than a human. So for example, you could have one that simply transcribes meeting notes, another one that takes action items out of meetings, another one that takes those action items and puts them into a roadmap, and that's it. That's all those individual ones do. Then at the center, you have an AI digital assistant or an AI operator, which divides out tasks among all the simpler agents and has memory over time of how you actually work. And it has autonomy to make decisions ultimately on your behalf. And this isn't science fiction. All of this technology largely exists. Those agents exist, the digital assistants exist, the prompts to make all this work exist. The only thing we're waiting for is just to be a little bit more cost efficient, which is coming down very, very quickly. And this makes every single element of cybercrime better. Of course, it makes criminals' life easier, but it also helps in the return of investment because it gives top criminals the one thing more valuable than money, which is time. Autonomy that comes from agentic AI takes a lot of the manual work off their plate. And it will make evolutions happen so often that they will actually feel like revolutions. So all in all, that will change from a model where criminals have cybercrime as a service to a new one where we will talk about cybercrime as a servant working for the criminals on their behalf. Imagine a current ransomware of a medical company, right, where they have lots of medical records. And of course, they've encrypted them and ransomed them. But that's all they've done with them. In this world, that criminal could have a series of agents. They could have one agent that simply goes through leaked data and extracts out medical details, another one that gets the contact details for the victims, and a third agent that emails the poor victims back and forth. Then the criminal could have an AI digital assistant where they simply ask it, I want you to go through this big trove of data that I have, extract out as many customers as you can actually ransom, send them emails, try and get money, send any money you get to the Bitcoin wallet that I gave you earlier, and send me a message every day on my phone at 12 o'clock to tell me how much money I made today. That's all very doable. That's about a year away from being possible in most cases. Also, more scale like this allows them to address a bigger market. we often show charts of ransomware and so on and pie charts, and it makes it feel like this is the entire addressable market for criminals divided among different groups. But in reality, the number of companies every year who get affected by ransomware is a tiny percentage of all of the organizations in the world. But when you can scale up with something like AI, suddenly they can actually target whole areas of the world that previously they didn't get around to. Areas like Southeast Asia or Latin America. Because a lot of the ransomware groups to date have been targeting Europe and the United States because they perceive that's where the wealth is. But when you're scaling things up to massive scales, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Secondly, with their ability to scale, they're going to need to leverage microservices. They're also going to need to have access to powerful GPUs to actually run all of these AI agents. And because of that, criminals will turn to cloud computing in a big way. So compromise of cloud accounts will go up substantially, but not for the old model of deploying crypto miners and so on. They will make use of all of our cloud accounts to essentially deploy AI agents to help operate their other actual crimes. And this actually isn't a futuristic topic. This has already started to happen. Some people are calling this LLM jacking. So we're already seeing examples of attackers compromising cloud accounts and then going after the kind of Gen AI as a service type offerings. For example, Amazon's Bedrock or Google have Vertex or things like that. They then resell those AI resources onto other cybercriminals who use them as the back end of their criminal chatbots or their jailbreak as a service, which we mentioned earlier. So to conclude, how do we proactively actually get ahead of this world? Well, there's two key parts to that. The first one is know the past and understand deeply the different crimes that brought us to this point, both at a tactical level, like the papers on the left, and also at a strategic level, papers that will be still making sense 5 years from now. Secondly, if you remember nothing else from the talk, distill your knowledge of cybercrime down to some very long-lasting key takeaways that will help guide you through cybercrime in the future, like our 3 rules of cybercrime or this emerging idea of cybercrime becoming a servant for criminals. Next, you need to know today and prepare for the future, or at least partner with somebody who actually does this all the time. The good news, though, is the security industry is in an excellent position to jump ahead of cybercrime in a big way. So why is that? Well, first of all, technology always leads and cybercrime follows later on. If you remember those 3 rules, criminals don't innovate unless they absolutely have to. Whereas, for example, in the security industry, I know in our company, we've been using machine learning since 2004 or 2005, something criminals still don't really do today because it's actually quite complex for them to deploy. The second thing is that industry will use this technology better. So when we come to AI, criminals have only started making use of it, whereas the industries of technology have invested billions of dollars already in this approach, making them get very far ahead. And no industry is better set up to take advantage of this than the cybersecurity industry. Because if you think about it, what does a security product actually do? Security products deploy sensors all around our organization. Those sensors generate logs. They send the logs to some cloud instance. The cloud then looks through those logs for anomalies and suspicious behavior, and then ultimately the product takes some sort of preventive action, blocks something or gives you a risk score or something like that. And Gen AI tooling is really, really good at ripping through logs at scale, especially when they can see multiple views of the same event. So overnight, that turns the potential weaknesses of our industry, that's a huge amount of data we have to process, into one of our strengths. And the current Gen AI approaches at their very best when you can feed data from multiple views of the same event. Now, this is a bit from a marketing slide. I deliberately dropped the name of the product here because I just want to talk about the middle bit. If you can see one threat from multiple views, like the endpoint on the cloud, the network view of it, email views of it, all at once, and you feed that to a large language model that can interpret all of that, genuinely feels like magic happens, how quickly it can pull apart and tell you exactly what is going on. Because AI sees the world like a security product does, or at least how a good security product does. If you're ever talking to someone today and they're still talking about good and bad and blocking like that, that is a very old view of security. Today, modern AI sees the world as a series of probabilities. That's what a large language model does. It gives you probabilities of the next word in a sentence. And a modern cyber risk exposure management security solution does the exact same thing. It sees the world in a series of risk probabilities. So it's very well suited for using AI. So we are now entering a new era that we're going to need to prepare from. We are entering an era where we will need to defend from threats from AI and threats to AI. And to do that, we will need to embrace an era where we have AI for security and also security for that AI. But if we embrace that deep knowledge of how criminals have worked in the past, I am certain we can jump ahead of them into an exciting, proactive future. Everybody, thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. McArdle, for your wonderful presentation. Thank you.